Thank you, Gary, and thank you to Diane and Mary for such an open exchange and conversation about where we are. The Institute's very proud to have helped CAR and develop the program for the next 2 days with CAR for this conference. And let me just give you a little sense of the Institute and what a unique entity it is. It's kind of a distinctive venture in academic council. It's the encapsulation of our president, Duke President Richard Burrhead's vision that the university should not just sit in its ivory tower, but should actually put itself at the service of society. And Nicholas Institute seeks to do that by bridging the expertise that we can command on a great research university's campus with those who are actually making decisions that try and fix our globe's great environmental problems. And while we think we're making progress on many of them, we have to also acknowledge that we continue to find a lot of demand for that work as we continue to have a lot of environmental problems to solve across the globe. I was blessed to be asked to found and create this institute, and I was doubly blessed to have a partner in the chairman of my board, Bill Reilly, to build the institute, the man I'm here to introduce. And I'll make this brief. I'd like to get Bill up here as quickly as I can, but let me just give a few thoughts about Bill and the issues we talk about today. We all know Bill's great service to our country as EPA administrator, as head of the World Wildlife Fund. But I want to note a few more specific items in Bill's background that helps him bring the perspective I think we need to move forward on climate change from this point in history. First, as many of us here look east to see if Washington can actually act on this challenge, I think it's important to remember that the last time our nation was able to successfully pass major environmental legislation, it was Bill Reilly at the helm of the EPA. That bill, the 1990 Clean Air Act, happened under his stewardship and also brought the cap-and-trade policy for SO2 that has been a great example here in California and for carbon markets. Second, it's also important to realize that Bill's a longtime resident of this state and has served on commissions for multiple governors to assess the challenge of climate change and the state's role in addressing it. As we here observe California's leadership over the next few days, I think Bill's perspective on the state's historic role will be useful for us to recall. Finally, Bill guides more than my institute in efforts to address climate change. Bill serves on many boards, but he chairs the Climate Works Foundation, which has created really an unparalleled philanthropic push to create solutions to climate change across the globe, and with an eye to the unique cultural and economic characteristics of each nation that's struggling with it. Thus, as we navigate together the American carbon world over the next 2 days, I can think of no better person to provide us the context and vision for what we will discuss. It is therefore my great pleasure to introduce my chairman, my great advisor, and my good friend, Bill Reilly.
Thank you, Tim, for a very nice introduction. I would remind this audience that Tim Profeta was the author, when he was working for Senator Lieberman, of what became the Waxman-Markey bill, and which then had the sponsorship of both Senators Lieberman and McCain, and in that early day had rather significant bipartisan support, which climate change regrettably no longer can claim. In thinking about this morning's program and listening to that marvelous opening by one of the foremost leaders on the issue in this state and in the country, Mary Nichols, I am moved to step back and say something about the national significance of what is happening in California. If I want first, however, as chairman of the board of Climate Works Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization founded with the support of the Hewlett and Packard and McKnight Foundations, and which makes something like $180 million a year in grants to and has established 3 regional foundations in India, China, and Europe, and will establish another one in Brazil within the next year or so, which has 6 best practice institutes on power and agriculture and land use and appliances and so forth. Announced yesterday morning before the market opened the appointment of a new Chief Executive Officer, Julie Blunden. She is Executive Vice President of SunPower, has a very distinguished record as one of the foremost leaders in solar energy in the United States and in the world. And SunPower, of course, is a very distinguished U.S. company that has been very successful in Germany and Spain, particularly, which have enjoyed feed-in tariffs, and also in California, which has a very large and growing body of solar installations. We're tremendously excited that Julie will take office on the 21st of May, and we will look to her for leadership in this field. If you look at the climate issue in the United States, one has to be struck by the extraordinary divergence between the preponderance of scientific opinion and the relative lethargy and complacency of the people. For a long time, it struck me that this was a matter of distraction. There are many reasons not to pay attention to climate change. Heaven knows the economic circumstances, particularly since 2008, have focused the attention of policymakers on other matters. The truth, though, is if you ask members of Congress whether they are for or were for Waxman-Markey or against, whether their constituents raise the issue with them, you rarely hear that they do, unless it's to complain about Waxman-Markey. For a long time, I thought that the Republicans in the House were more ideologically motivated than responsive to their politics. I've really learned, however, and one member of Congress from Oklahoma helped me understand that in his district there were two issues that were he to be on the wrong side of, he might just wisely retire. One of those was cap and trade. How we ever got into that bullseye with constituents of a rural Oklahoma congressional district, really, I don't get. But it happens to be a reality. And I think we simply have to face, particularly those of us in the environmental community who have been advocating on this issue for 20 or more years, it hasn't worked. Something about what we have been doing hasn't worked. And we have to draw the consequences. We have been spending in the environmental community tens of millions of dollars a year, particularly in the recent past, on trying to change public attitudes and improve policies to address climate change. We have had 11 national academies of science around the world say that the climate is warming and humans are contributing to that warming. The president of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States, Ralph Cicerone, has said, "We know three things for certain. Average temperatures are rising, the sea level is rising, and glaciers are melting." But it hasn't gotten traction. So I want to make some suggestions about how we address the current state of public attitudes in the United States and the apparent unresponsiveness of not just of Congress but of the constituents behind them. And my first suggestion is pay attention to what is and talk about it, without necessarily bringing in theories about causation, whether it's human-caused or divine-caused or caused by space aliens. Just leave it alone. Strictly talk about the changes which now are obvious and undeniable. When I served in office and we advocated the Treaty on Climate Change, the Convention on Climate Change, which President Bush, first President Bush, did propose, a treaty, by the way, which obligated the United States and other signatories, and the United States was the first developed country to sign it, to return their CO2 contributions to where they had been, greenhouse gas emissions, in 1990 by the year 2000. Created a moral obligation, not a legally enforceable one. When we did that, we had the preponderance of scientific opinion with us. We did have that, but really largely based upon computer models. We did not yet have the record of significant change, of melting Arctic sea ice, for example, to point to. We do now. We should make more of it. So that's my first recommendation. And one of the things that is happening right here. The cap-and-trade program here, if it is successful, can have a profound influence on the readiness of the rest of the country and the rest of the world to follow suit. I have been tremendously impressed by some of the progress that has been made in Europe in encouraging the creation and finding that it's making a significant contribution of renewable fuels, renewable energy. Germany had set itself a goal of 20% of its electrical energy by the year 2020. It's already there. And they're proposing to go to 80% by 2050. And based upon their record to date, I wouldn't count them out. The Kyoto experience got off to a somewhat faulty start, slow start, because they over-allocated allowances. But they've corrected that. They're reducing it now, and we're beginning to see a response. And they're actually reducing the allowances in total as a consequence of lesser demand, lower price. That's the way markets work after the downturn economically. It was very impressive to me when the chairman of DuPont, Chad Holliday, testified before Senator Inhofe and others, the Public Works Committee, Senator Boxer, on climate change, and was pressed very hard on how his company would be affected by carbon regulation. And he said, well, we're already affected. We have 35 plants that are in Kyoto-compliant countries. We're doing fine. Chairman of General Electric said the same thing. And by the way, that points to a reality. I'm not aware of a CEO in today's American economy, a significant company CEO, who doesn't expect that we will eventually get carbon regulation and isn't preparing his or her company to deal with it. The reality of what is happening then is some significant measures, and some in this country, like the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the New England states, of which one of the important founding partners was one Governor Romney of Massachusetts, are working. RGGI has recently reduced its own allowances, seeing that the downturn reduced demand and the price. RGGI has a floor price, too, which the National Commission on Energy Policy, which I co-chaired some years ago, had recommended that as a reassuring metric. And that, too, I think, has great promise to address this issue in a significant and productive way. We need to remind the country, then, first of all, that we are seeing climate change and that there are responses to it that are fully consistent with our economic future, the one that we want. Climate Works' own philosophy is very much, don't ask any country to do what is not in its economic self-interest. Energy efficiency really is. It turns out you can talk about energy efficiency in places where you can't talk about climate change. I spend a lot of time in Texas associating with a business there that private equity group I've been involved with has acquired. And Texans are very much in favor of energy efficiency, of energy independence, and of renewables. They have vastly more wind power than any other state, and they were the first to embark strongly on that road under their then Governor George W. Bush. So you can talk about that, and Texans are in favor of it. You could talk about it in China long before climate change was permissible as a subject in Chinese conversations. Well, so language is important sometimes, and the way these issues are framed, I think, also matters. But focus on what is. Secondly, look to adaptation. I used to think adaptation is the back door to the acknowledgement of the need for mitigation, of the need to actually do something about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I'm beginning to think it's the front door. If you look around the country, I co-chaired with John Bryson, who's now Secretary of Commerce, was then head of California Edison, Southern California Edison, a commission here, a task force on adaptation. And what we saw suggested a very different future for many parts of the California economy as a consequence of relatively small 1 or 2 degree increases in average temperatures. Those affecting agriculture, water availability, vineyards, fires and forest fires, the incidence will go up in response to a simple degree, average temperature. Well, those kinds of changes, and I also was a member of the governor's task force, the Blue Ribbon Task Force on the future of the Delta, and learned that of the vulnerability that it has to changes in weather patterns that produce severe storms. And the coincidence of a severe storm and flooding can inundate some 1,100 miles of levees, which I suspect, Mary, ought to be eligible for some of that money you were talking about. Try to strengthen them. Those kinds of questions, I think, are practical questions. They're prudent issues of management of cities for planning commissions and zoning commissions, for mayors and governors, and they can be non-ideological. The best example of a place where they were is Chicago. I grew up in Illinois, and I think it's possible that when my grandchildren are grown, the state will be unrecognizable. The city of Chicago assembled the best people at its universities and asked them to look at the likely future that the state and city will face. They concluded that under the most likely scenarios of climate change, several key tree species will no longer make it in Chicago. And so the 2,200 trees that are planted now in the city of Chicago annually no longer include the state tree, the white ash. They've banned the Norway spruce and the maple. They have a crash program to change the paving to make it permeable, 80% permeable to rainwater, and also they've created a rubbery substance that will cause it to become very flexible so that the freezing and thawing will not wreak the damage that it otherwise would. They are very famous for their green roofs. They save some $6 million a year, I think, as a consequence of adaptations they've been making to buildings and offices. They expect that based upon a very hot summer a few years ago when 800 people died, twice the number that died in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, they will have to improve their emergency room capability to handle people with heat stroke, up to 1,200 a summer. And instead of 15 days of temperatures above 90 in the summer, they're expecting 72. The climate of Chicago will more appropriately resemble the climate of Birmingham, Alabama, and therefore they're planting Alabama sweet gum in their parks. All of this was being done under a non-ideological mayor, Mayor Daley. It's called the Chicago Action Plan. It's not unique. It's probably, I think, the most progressive of any of the adaptation plans that I have seen. But there are 1,000 cities in the United States which have signed up to a commitment to adapt to predictable changes, but not just predictable, things that are already beginning to happen in the nation's cities. So while Washington may be dithering, a lot of our most progressive cities are acting. The third message that I would give has to do with the way in which we communicate about this issue, and it's something that I think I detect has been somewhat off-putting to a certain part of the constituency based on some polling that I have seen, and it is this. Drop the moral rectitude. I personally think that what Governor Brown said, was quoted as having said in 1981, was absolutely right on and ahead of his time. I think this is a profoundly consequential moral issue. I think the United States is sleeping through climate change. The nearest analogy I can think of was the British population in the 1930s, when they knew that Germany was rearming, but found other things to preoccupy themselves with. Nevertheless, I don't think that we will reach or have reached the population at large, the people who must finally believe in the necessity of preparing for and of ameliorating climate change. And therefore, I would say, stick to what is, focus upon adaptation. One final thought about the economic consequences of cap and trade. You know, when we proposed cap and trade as part of the acid rain title of the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, the utilities predicted, after their own economic analyses, that the cost of sulfur dioxide's reduction would be between $1,300 and $1,600 a ton. My own EPA's prediction, which the Council of Economic Advisors shared, was that the cost would come in at between $600 and $800 a ton. In the event, it came in at under $200 a ton, well under $200 a ton. That, by the way, is a habit that EPA has had of overestimating the economic cost of its own regulations, contrary to what one would think is the self-interest of the agency. But in virtually every case I can think of, going back some 30 years, there was an underestimation of the consequences of incentives to produce technological change. I think one will see that again in cap and trade. Now, obviously, California, even though it is the 9th largest economy in the world, cannot carry this burden alone. We have to hope and expect that the example that this state sets is sufficiently constructive, economically benign, and reassuring to other states and people that it will create a wildfire of emulation. That must be our hope. We are well started on this. I congratulate Governor Schwarzenegger, Governor Brown, Mary Nichols, all of the people who've been associated with this initiative, going back to Art Rosenfeld, who conceived that we could have economic growth and development here by, at the same time, keeping energy use constant, something he believed in the 1970s and which California has proved right. I very much hope and expect California will continue on that path. We will have to do it in many other areas as well. Water impacts, I think, will be among the first felt as a consequence of significant climate change, and this state obviously is vulnerable to those. But again, we have a good example in some of our cities. Los Angeles has added significant population in the last 30 years, but at the same time kept water use constant per capita, and that is true for the country as a whole. It's largely a consequence of improvements in agricultural use and industrial use. We're going to have to do it again. We're going to have some 20 million more people, so existing per capita use in California of water cannot remain where it is. We have a great deal to do. These resource issues are inextricably connected one with another. I think we have the intellectual capacity in this state, and although the state is so frequently seen as ungovernable with respect to climate change, I think we're doing just fine. Thank you.